Good morning, everybody. It's an incredible privilege to be with you here this morning. My thanks to the organizing committee, the board, friends in the audience for inviting me to be here today. And I would invite you all to explore this question that we're going to be exploring on the panel today around how diversity, innovation, and AI are accelerating the future of healthcare. These are big, meaty topics, and I'm delighted that we have a distinguished guest of panelists to explore this with today. So as Mike mentioned, I'm the Chief Medical Scientist at Microsoft Research and a practicing physician in the NHS. The last 20 years for me have been one of multiple different rotations. You could argue that I've never stopped training. I've spent most of the last 20 years across the payer, provider, regulatory, and life sciences side of healthcare. For the eagle-eyed among you, or the travelers among you, you'll notice that there's a logo of Hamleys up there, which is a large toy store in London, one of the oldest toy stores in the world. And I used to sell magic tricks at Hamleys to pay my way through medical school, but there will be a reason for why I'm sharing this with you in a moment. And feel free to connect if that would be helpful on social media or otherwise, very open to having a conversation with you. And if I was to be grounded in one thing throughout the course of the career that I've had the privilege of having so far, it's around being grounded in the patients and public that I serve. I remember the first book that I would use on my ward rounds as a house officer or a junior resident in the US, the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine. The opening paragraph, which I did not pay attention to until 25 years later, stated, "Medicine is an exercise of our imagination. We enter another person's suffering to end it. If there can be no respite, then we stay with our patients until the end. Beyond this, there is no higher ideal." I would ask you, in everything that we do, be you a regulator, be you an innovator, be you a provider, be you a physician, we have to think about innovation in its broadest sense, and ultimately the public value that we give of this innovation, in be it technology, medicines, healthcare service design, what have you. And within the context of this, we have to start thinking through these notions of diversity, innovation, and AI in ways that perhaps we have only begun to embark upon. And as an opening gambit to some of the conversation we're going to have, I would argue that diversity is the fuel of innovation. It enables us to generate novel and diverse ideas that can address the complex and evolving challenges of health and life sciences. I would argue that diversity is a moral obligation upon all of us. It's a critical imperative for us to think about diversity in our teams, diversity in the questions that we're asking, leveraging the experience of those around us and their lived experience and the lived experiences of those that we serve, so that we can articulate the most challenging problems that society has in order to deliver the most important innovations for humankind. Innovation itself is the science of transformation. It empowers us to create new products, services, processes that can improve the quality and efficiency of the health and life sciences. And prior to being at Microsoft, I was at Merck MSD for a number of years, and I remember a famous quote by George Merck, and a conversation that my mentor and friend Mike and I would have is around, how do you bring that to life? And the quote was, "We cannot rest until a way has been found with our help to bring our finest achievements to everyone." I think we have an important set of conversations to have across the ecosystem of health, not just to have the clever ideas, but to create the receptive adoption environment for these innovations to breathe life in the real world. And what an exciting time that we live in. We've heard previous speakers speak a little bit around AI, and I believe AI is an accelerator of transformation. If you think about what ChatGPT and OpenAI and Bing and other innovations that have happened recently, AI can help us discover novel insights, optimize processes and personalize outcomes. It will not be a replacement for human intelligence, but a partner that can enhance our capabilities and creativity. Arthur C. Clarke said that any advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And the first time that I started to play with some of these tools, it was completely indistinguishable from the experience that I would have as that magician on the front door of Hamleys. And I'd invite us all to capture some of that opportunity, play with these tools, and imagine what the future could hold if we could unlock the true potential. And ultimately, together, diversity, innovation, and AI create a hugely powerful synergy that can drive transformation across the health and life sciences. I'm delighted to have a distinguished panel that will be joining us now, and I invite them to come to the stage. Please join me in welcoming them. So my thanks to Amir, Najat, Zak, and Armen for joining us this morning. Amir, if we can begin by just kicking off and consider the current state of play, what the future could look like if we were to deliver against the promise of diversity, innovation, and across what we do. And Amir, you and I have known each other for a number of years. You're involved in a number of different organizations, have a perspective across health and life sciences. How could you share some of your insights around what you're involved in driving diversity and innovation, and share some of your experiences with the audience?
Sure, I'll start by saying, backstage we were a bit late. We were discussing who was going to be the comedy and who was going to be serious on this panel. So Zak, you were elected to do the comedy, okay? So we can be serious. I can take many examples to think about diversity and innovation. I won't take any company examples. I think for today, I'll mention 2 collaborations, which I think is a good theme for DIA, right? So in terms of diversity, I think let's talk about DTRA. That's the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, which I have the pleasure of co-leading with Craig Lipsey, which many people in this room know very well, with the help of many people like Jane Mars and others who have really been working very hard to get to what we're trying to do with DTRA, which is basically our vision is to make sure that everyone has access to research, which is not true right now. And the way we want to do that is to accelerate adoption of methodologies, centralized methodologies, right? And this was done, we were thinking about this pre-COVID. It wasn't because of COVID where everyone had to kind of go decentralized. And it just happened that COVID hit us, and we launched with over 120 entities, government, biopharma, tech companies like yours, service companies, sites, patient groups. And this very diverse group came together and came up with 4 priorities that we should work on to try and increase adoption of decentralized methodologies. Those led to 12 initiatives that have literally hundreds of people, many in this audience, working very hard every day to deliver on. And I'm happy that we're going to deliver on those 12 initiatives this year, Amazing. Which is quite an achievement. Some of them are very ambitious. So I think that's an example really where we're actually adding diversity to the patients that come into trials, and we get a diverse group of people to work together, incredibly collaborative competitors, who come together and work. So I love that. So that's kind of the example of that. In terms of driving innovation, I'll give you an unusual one, which is one of my other hats is CNS Summit, which stands for Collaborating for Novel Solutions. And for a long time now, probably over 10 years, we've developed an index for digital innovation in pharma, CNS Summit Innovation Index. And what that did was, many people have seen rankings of pharma based on molecular, innovation, right? This was innovation digitally, which 10 years ago really wasn't that common or that thought of. So we've been assessing biopharma across multiple domains over the years and just seeing how the digital transformation is going. And it's been very useful for them to have a third-party independent look at this, and frankly have benchmarking of how they're doing, maybe even get more resources internally if they're not doing so well in the ranking. Yeah. So that's a sort of unusual way of driving kind of digital by really trying to let people know where they are in the world.
And one thing I've seen of you is you'll often think of scale, and you'll often also think about challenging the status quo. And Najat, if I could invite you to maybe share a little bit about your background, your work at Janssen, what you do, and how do you think about diversity when you consider innovation, specifically AI-related transformation in your organization, and indeed across the broader ecosystem?
Yeah, no, first of all, thank you, and it's great to be here. What a great set of panelists.
Yeah.
So here's what I say, a little bit about me. I head up 2 organizations at Janssen, which is the pharma arm of J&J. So I head up the strategy, portfolio, and operations. So that's really like the heartbeat and the engine of any pharma company. That's the place where you make really tough decisions and also exciting decisions on what's going to be the next set of medicines that we deliver for patients. That's the mantra, that's the core mission. I also head up another organization. I'm the Chief Data Science Officer. So all aspects of data science, AI, machine learning, real-world evidence, I head that up from target ID all the way through getting the medicine to approved and to patients and line extensions and so forth. I say that because at the end of the day, if you really want to transform, evolve, illuminate, et cetera, an organization and how you make medicines, which is the core reason a lot of us are here today, you have to do it from the center of it. You have to do it from where you invest in your strategy, how you're making decisions about designing programs to executing them. So a little bit about diversity and inclusion. I mean, personally to me, first of all, it's the diversity of your team and your talent, right? Why is that important? Because at the end of the day, I mean, I can talk about all the stats that show that you get better results when you have diversity in your leadership team and your every single level of your team. But the reason it's important is we innovate by the ideas we generate. And you want ideas to be generated by those with diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences, diverse thoughts. I mean, personally for me on the data science organization, half the team are women. In an industry where I can tell you it's in single digits is the average, and that doesn't happen by accident. Also, we have people from over 30 different countries. So, you know, we talked a little bit about being global in our mindset. That becomes really important in terms of how you pick the questions. The second thing I would say is diversity in how we design and deliver our medicines, right? So take clinical trials as an example. There have been so many stats, it's 3%, 4%. We're very low in terms of the patients that are eligible, but also from a diversity perspective. So that's where we use machine learning, for instance, to actually look at where, like understanding which patients are eligible, over-indexing in areas that have more diversity, differences in socioeconomic status. And it's not just an example. We have multiple trials where most of our diverse recruitment is actually coming from new areas that have been generated by both the ML algorithms coupled with operational excellence. If you don't have great operational excellence, you don't get to the finish line, right? And then the third piece that I would say is really around diversity of your data, algorithms, methodologies, and approaches. It's not just important to use machine learning the right way and to do exciting things, but you have to make sure your data sets are representative. That's a challenge, because a lot of the times they're generated not for research purposes, right? And a lot of the times the type of healthcare you get if you're a person of color versus not, unfortunately, reality looks very different, not just in the US, but globally. So being very upfront, ensuring that our data sets are representative, and going through the hard work of making sure your algorithms are generalizable, not just when you develop it, but once you deploy it, time and time again, to make sure there's no data drift and other things happening. And to close it all out, listen, Amir, you share some great examples about decentralized trials. Yeah, COVID made a push, but let's face it, like we have decentralized trials, fully remote immunoderm trials, where the patients are actually taking images, sending it to their physicians. We recruited like the first patient within 45 minutes of going live. That doesn't happen, but that is not just the future. You can make it happen. That required teamwork. It's a team sport. Our clinical team, data science, operations, regulators, et cetera. And I will say I'm proud to say that over half of the participants are people of color. It can happen. It's just a matter of changing the status quo and really living into that future.
Thank you. And I always learn a lot whenever we have our conversations. And I think the other bit, is leadership. And you demonstrate tremendous leadership. And it's not easy. I'm sure you face multiple barriers, which we'll come to shortly. But you have to push through if you're trying to do the right thing. Armen, welcome. And if I could come to you, you're at Flagship Pioneering. Many of the audience will know Flagship, some will not. Perhaps you could share a little bit around Flagship and how you identify which endeavors to truly go after, and how you support both diversity of ideas and ventures that have the potential to really transform society all up, in addition to the human condition.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here. It's also a pleasure to be with all my fellow panelists. So Flagship is a company that conceives, develops, and grows bioplatform ventures. So we create about 6 to 8 companies every year. The most well-known of the companies that Flagship has created is probably Moderna Therapeutics, that most of you probably will know about. We use a very structured process to company creation. It's almost like kind of the opposite of what people would think about entrepreneurship, which is more of a kind of semi-romantic process. A couple people meeting in a garage over lunch, coming up with ideas, writing on a napkin, and then iterating. In our case, it's a very institutional, very structured. It's a team sport for us, to Najat's point earlier. What we try to do is to, in terms of your question, Junaid, where do we go? We try to push ourselves to go beyond what we call adjacency zone. So if an idea that we come up with, again, these are all ideas that we literally conceive internally, we don't have anyone pitch it to us. But if an idea we come up with, we can look at it and literally draw on paper how we are going to implement it. That's not an idea that we'll pursue at Flagship. It should be an idea where you'd look at it and say, this is semi-crazy, we don't know if it can be done. And those are the ideas that we'll go after. The other thing that I think we have somewhat of an advantage in terms of starting is we don't start with a solution, neither we start with a problem. Meaning we don't say this is technology, we want to utilize it, or we don't say this is a problem we should tackle. We try to find permutations of both that actually fit very well. And this actually expands the space, our search space that we can actually look into and try to then find ideas that we can work on. Again, in this process, we create 6 to 8 companies a year, as I said. Now, in terms of diversity, one thing that has happened quite a lot is kind of using some of the AI tools as I was just literally looking at the Illuminate sign, to illuminate us, literally to think of ideas we would never think about. One of the things that I think most of us, if we have used ChatGPT, would consider the drawback would be hallucinations, right? Kind of creating things that are factually maybe not very accurate. For us, it's a feature, actually. It's not a bug. We actually would want to prompt these models to create hallucinations. And if they hallucinate more, the better for us, because actually it prompts us to think about ideas that potentially we as humans would never think about. And that's how we make connections from where we are now to potentially leap into areas that we would potentially never do if it wasn't for the tools that we have.
Amazing. And you've a beautiful segue, I think, into Zak. So the conversations around AI are nothing new. They've been going on for years and years and years. I wonder if the context now is different, especially when we think about the post-GPT-4 era. And Zak, you've literally recently written a book on the AI revolution in medicine, GPT-4 and beyond. You're the editor-in-chief at the New England Journal of Medicine for AI. What are the things that truly excite you the most in this new era of LLMs? And what do you think the impact could be on society and healthcare and life sciences overall?
So I have to be true to myself and be narrow and crass to start with. When I hear my colleague here from Flagship, I'm reminded that 2 of their AI-driven companies, one named Generate and one codenamed, are both technically led by graduates actually of my own lab. and my point here is that there's an enormous ecosystem, especially in Boston, I have to say. I'm a Boston bigot, even though I grew up in Geneva, Switzerland. And that allows there to be a cross-pollination of these companies and academia. And we have to think about how to continually invest and reinvest in that. So that's my crass perspective. More broadly, let me give you, as always, it's better to give a story than, unfortunately, facts. I happen to be the principal investigator of the Undiagnosed Disease Networks Coordinating Center, led out of Harvard, but involves 12 academic health centers coast to coast. And until very recently, we had a very successful process where we would evaluate patients with a team and then sequence their genome, and then based on a small number of candidate mutations, decide which one of these are the likely candidate, and then do a CRISPR knock-in into a model organism and say, that's the cause of this individual's disease. And we've actually helped literally hundreds of individuals, having evaluated, I'd say about 35% of the individuals referred to us. Back in October, when I was first introduced to GPT-4, I ran by it one of the cases that we had failed to diagnose, because we had 5 gene candidates which were leading, but none of the clinical findings were typical. And I just fed into GPT-4 the whole case. And I said, which one of these is the one causing disease? And it picked one. Sounded reasonable, but meanwhile, we were also doing the bench work to validate it, and so happens, for exactly the reasons it articulated, that was the mutation. And so I heard before us, we just heard about patients and patient-driven research. The Undiagnosed Disease Network is very much such a network. And frankly, that's where we get a huge driver for diversity. Mm-hmm. We've reached out to colleagues in the Atlanta area. And yes, both through Morehouse, for example, but also through local churches, we recruit patients, talk to one another, and we recruit patients who are aware. And I think the promise of these new technologies is a real democratization of expertise. And I think medicine is going to have a challenge because patients who have life and death decisions ahead of them are going to have a tool that is going to allow them to speak the same language and be sometimes more up to date than the clinicians that are caring for them. And so I think it's an interesting challenge for medical education, for the practice of medicine, for the value proposition that our institutions are providing to us as patients.
And if I was to ask you to make a prediction, like if you go, let's call it 5 years from now, how do you think things evolve and change? Do we believe that GPT-4 or its incumbents become ubiquitous across the health ecosystem? And if so, what does that future look like?
So I recognize I'm at DIA, and I would like to make some comments maybe afterwards about the impact on life sciences.
Please do.
But on the patient side, here's the real question. There's no doubt patients and doctors are going to be using it ubiquitously to do their administrative jobs. We have, even in non-HIPAA compliant fashion, doctors tweeting about dumping in the patient record and getting pre-authorization letters written in a second. And so it'll be used. The question is the medical establishment going to embrace it in a timely fashion? And that remains to be seen. We've all been disappointed by how fast medicine as an organized discipline picks up these things. So I can predict it'll be ubiquitous, used by young doctors, older doctors, by patients of all stripes. The only question is, to what degree will the medical establishment be using it? And I think that's going to remain an open question. With regard to the life sciences, I just want to say one just factoid, which is, on the one hand, there's so many processes in life sciences that can be sped up. On the other hand, we have to be very careful about extrapolating from the amazing linguistic supremacy of these large language models to what it can do with our data.
Yeah.
Because our data, turns out, in the life sciences is very, very focused and boutiqued around individual questions. And it does not support answering all questions. And there's going to be a real important discussion about what data needs to be developed pre-competitively and then competitively in order to get the full benefit of these foundation models. Ultimately, I think it's going to be transformative.
Yeah.
The answer to my question is going to determine whether it's going to be within the next 5 years or in the next 15 years.
Amazing. Amir, did you want to come in?
Sure. I want to actually sort of speak to every person in this room, really, and sort of say the following. So what I've noticed is the people who've been closest to this technology, like Zak, have been the most excited, like more excited. And Zak is not a hype guy, as he would say in the book, right? He's the most skeptical guy, but he is incredibly excited about it, right? And yet he's also terrified. And this is what I found with all my friends who truly understand, what's going on. They are at the same time excited. In fact, later on you can ask Zak what he did when he was thrashing. If you haven't read the book, you can ask him where it was. There's nothing naughty. I think it's perfectly fine. But you can ask him why it made him thrash. Okay. But the point is that people closest to are really scared and excited. Other people have no idea. They just think this is a better Google. They just don't understand yet. What I would say to everyone in this room is you need to actually get engaged, because this is unlike any other technology in terms of its uptake, right? And our industry has a history of being extremely slow. I mean, more so than healthcare, because we are more regulated too. But everyone in this room can think of many things that took way longer than we thought. And people may think, I might be retired by then. I don't really need to learn about this stuff. But honestly, this is the one time where this thing is just going to be everywhere. How it's going to be accepted, et cetera, as Zach says. But I think if you want to be really in this industry, this is not a technology you can ignore. You can't sit on the sidelines. So you need to learn how to do a good prompt, that kind of thing, and get engaged, because it's definitely a phase shift. And I'm not sure everyone understands that. And although people think it's really hyped up, in some ways it's not hyped up enough, quite honestly.
Interesting. And Najat, you're going to come in.
Yeah, if I can just underscore something that Zach said. I mean, big picture, with any new technology, it's always best to actually use it to understand firsthand. Like, for me, oh gosh, it takes me sometimes forever to frame an email the right way, because you know who you're sending it to. I can just put that in ChatGPT and say, please make it more formal, and it's like seconds. So for me, that adds productivity. I love learning, continuous learning. You're constantly learning about topics. I will say, so make it your own is what I would say, but it is a prompt. It is a co-pilot, right? I get a lot of questions like, is this going to replace a person? It's going to be a co-pilot. It's something that's augmenting. And that's where judgment comes in terms of how it's used versus not, right? So that's one piece. But Zach's point was super important, which is, a lot of these foundational models, for ChatGPT is based on language, based on texts that we have generated. When you think about chemistry and biology, that also has its own language. Chemistry in terms of atoms, biology in terms of amino acids and so forth. The reality is, this is the opportunity and just the realistic check. There are so many gaps in our understanding of chemistry and biology. We are editors. We are not creators of it, right? So I say that because it's really important that this is going to help us fill in some of those gaps. And Zach's points are really important in terms of what data are we generating, and then how are we training these algorithms, and then all of the active learning, reinforcement learning to fill those gaps. But it's not ready yet. And I think that's really important to understand. Huge difference in terms of the uptake in that space versus just pure language and building foundational models on top of that.
Yeah, I think a way to think about it is that GPT-4 had everything that human beings thought were important to say on the web and even in other databases. So intrinsically, it's relevant to human beings. Mm-hmm. Our chemistry data, our biology data, is only a biopsy driven by some of our interests by chance, but it's still not everything that's relevant to human medicine. Exactly. And so we've got a significant challenge there. I would just want to echo what you said, which is you've got to use it. It's going to be very, very awkward for doctors to have patients coming with differential diagnoses that they themselves have not thought of. It's going to be awkward for lead scientists to have junior people say, well, this compound is known to have the following off-target effects. But I do want to say that there is one aspect that you could start using today. I think Najat is right. It's too early for some things. Our administrative processes. Mm-hmm. Remember, in medicine, 1/3 of our costs in the United States are administrative. Billing, reimbursement. That's easy pickings for AI. And there are a number of administrative processes in clinical trials and in target selection. Just to give you an insight, I describe in the book how I took from the web a consent form. And now you tell GPT, be the front end to that consent form. And a patient can ask the consent form, if I'm in the control arm, will I get an injection? If I'm in the control arm, do I get any benefit? What's the likelihood that I will get a medication? All those questions that we never have time to answer now can be answered at the pace of the inquirer.
Mm-hmm. And Armen, you wanted to come in, and if I could ask you to maybe think about the conditions that you're setting within Flagship to encourage the adoption and the practice and the play with some of these tools.
Yeah, so I'll get to that in a second. I was just going to make a comment based on what my colleagues just said. About, I think, 4 weeks ago, I literally asked myself, I said, before I even do anything, can I see if ChatGPT, GPT-4 can help me? So it's like almost my mindset has been, before I even start working on a deck, on a document, let me see if it can be useful. And more likely than not, it is actually very useful. And in that case, I actually use it as a co-pilot, to Najat's point, in almost everything that I do. Again, I'm not going to upload a confidential document into ChatGPT or GPT-4 as much as I trust Microsoft. I still don't do it. But it's extremely useful, right? Now to your question, what we are developing at Flagship is multiple co-pilots. We have an exploration co-pilot that literally helps us explore unknown white spaces. And it's actually been rolled out across Flagship to everyone. We have given guidance to everyone saying how you can use this. So again, in terms of kind of confidential data, don't upload it. But otherwise, everyone is free, and we completely encourage people to use it. We have scientific co-pilots that actually, if a scientist is using it, we are asking scientists to actually use it. Again, you can ask it to pretend to be a scientist and actually have a conversation with it. And then we also have an operational co-pilot. So anything that's operational, almost there is no constraints. If our procurement is using it, wants to know how to negotiate X, Y, or Z, very happily they can use the operational co-pilot to do it. So we have very much, I think, embraced what LLMs provide, especially kind of trained on our language models. But at the same time, we're also working on developing LLMs that are not trained on English text or other text, but are trained on biological data or chemical data.
So I'm conscious there's huge excitement, but we'd be remiss of us if we didn't also talk about the anxiety that people have. And I wonder if we could also start to think about how we collectively address some of the ethical, societal, and regulatory implications of AI. Amir, if I could come to you first, but I also know that you might want to ask a broader question. So over to you in terms of how you think we might start that.
I think why should we do all the work? We've got all these people in this room. So I want everyone to be truthful and brave, okay? Put your hand up if you have not used ChatGPT 3 or Bard, which should be available to most people.
If you've not used it.
If you have not used it. Put your hand up just so we can see, please. Okay, that's great. So majority of people have actually, right? Thank you for those put your hand up. I appreciate that. It gives us a more scientific. So, I mean, honestly, I think it's good to know. I was curious in this crowd how many people have used it, right? I think it's going to come to a point where, right now when you forget your phone and you have to go home to get it, you can't imagine yourself leaving. I think, to Armen's point, I think soon you're going to feel like if you don't use any of these AIs, you feel it's like your phone, that you've failed, you're missing an arm. So it's kind of, we're going to get there. There's no question.
And if we then extend it to some of the anxieties, those societal, ethical considerations, I don't know if you have any thoughts, or Zak, if you have any thoughts on how we might start to address some of those challenges. One is, I suppose, we have to understand what this thing is and actually leverage it first before we make decisions about it. But separately to that, how could we collectively, especially when we think about the regulators in the room, or indeed those people just on the cusp, they're not ready yet, what would we advise them?
As a shrink, I can talk about anxiety all day, but I'm going to let Zak have a go because he's written the book on this. So Zak, you go first.
So, I think, in terms of regulation, it was really quite entertaining to watch Sam Altman, who actually wrote kind words about our book, so I feel like a little bit sheepish about saying the following, but nonetheless I'll say it, which is to see him in front of Congress saying, regulate us. And the reason it was interesting to see him do that because they've got it made there. They are now in the front seat. And if Google and Microsoft and a few others get regulation, that's a great barrier to keep all the other efforts out because it creates, as you know, regulatory lock-in. But I think we need to think more broadly, which is there are societal values which are buried in these models at many, many levels. One is the data from which it's drawn. The other is the so-called alignment process, which also puts values in it so that, for example, as my kids found out, I have young kids and the boys are nasty, and they asked GPT-4 to write a rap around Biden, which it did, and then a rap about Trump, which we refuse to. And so you see what it tells you, these are the alignments that are there. And then there is the kind of who gets to have access to it. So all those things are societal decisions. And they represent different trade-offs. And I can tell you, because I've been thinking a lot about it, because we're going to be hosting an international meeting about this, there's going to be different trade-offs in China, in Europe, and in the United States, at the very least. And these are not just technical regulatory differences. These are broad societal differences, and it relates to how you validate them, how you train them, where the data comes from, who you share it with. I think these are incredibly important organizational societal decisions. Frankly, the reason we wrote the book was to actually engage in a societal discussion, which I think is really urgent.
Najat, and then Armen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's important to do important things and do it the right way. But if I can just bring the conversation back to all of these different approaches, there's limitations and there's opportunity. But what are the things we can do? Like just imagine this for a second, and it's real, so it's not 10 years away. First of all, you want to figure out why someone has a disease. And we are not perfect at that yet, right? Understanding that, as I mentioned before. There are now, ML-enabled targets that we have found that are in the pipeline. Why is that important? You think about new medicines, that's where it starts. You got to figure out what the problem is. Why is it that someone's having the disease? Is it only selective in the tissues where you have the disease, the cancer versus not? Super important so the patient doesn't have a lot of side effects. Second thing, you know what the root of the problem is? Then it's how do you actually make a molecule? And a lot of the foundational models that Zak and others were talking about, they're actually completely changing how you design molecules. You don't design it from scratch. You can actually predict the right starting point, and then it's your co-pilot to very quickly get to the right molecule that has the right properties. Binds to that problematic protein well, has good properties that you don't have safety issues down the line. Then if you think about what do you do next? You got to test it in human trials. And today when you do human trials, how do we design it? We design it based on experience and knowledge. That's great. But let's add to it the entirety of real world data. How are patients doing? Are they all actually staying on their comparative drug? What are the endpoints that are being collected? We have talked for decades about collapsing clinical research and clinical care together to do trials at point of care trials. Mm-hmm. That's how you do it, right? You actually change the endpoints that you're using. For instance, in neuroscience, we're now using digital endpoints, not as an idea, it's in the trial, where you're using augmented reality, use of games to just understand cognitive decline. You can pick up Alzheimer's multiple years in advance, very early stage. Why is that important? That leads to the next step, which is decentralized trials. You can't decentralize if the patient has to go to the physician all the time. And let's face it, a lot of our clinical endpoints are imperfect because they're, you're adding things on pen and paper. And then the last thing I'll say is trials, right? If you know who your patient population is, if you can drive precision medicine based on the biological understanding, not just what the name of a disease is, but the biological understanding of the disease, then what you can do is actually go to where the patients are. Use these machine learning algorithms for good to say, where are the patients that would benefit from my medicines? It's de-identified, so you're doing it the right way, but you know who the PIs are. So you bring the trial to the patient. We've talked about this for years. What is the advantage of doing all of this? You have the right patient, the right medicine, the right evidence, and the right level of diversity that's representative of the trials you're in, right? This is not just an idea. There are programs like that in the pipeline. There's over 50 programs, clinical trials, where we're using machine learning algorithms to design it, to create the right evidence, to execute it. We see multiple percentage higher recruitment now. I just want to leave by saying those are all of the reasons why you do it, because there's enough room for improvement in how you make a medicine, 10% success rate, right? But then the bottom part, which is the question you asked, is super important, to do it the right way. And I think one thing that's very important, you can have the right data, right algorithms, transparency. We need to build trust. That's the thing that's actually missing right now. Transparency. So the more you use it, you understand how it works. The more you say, listen, this is what we have, these are my gaps, these are the limitations, just like you do in a good paper. That's what's needed, transparency with the physicians, with the patients, with life science companies, all across the board.
Thank you. Armen, and then I can see the timer, so I'm going to get shouted at in a moment, but you had a comment, and then I'm going to try and wrap things up.
I'm going to keep it very short. I think I'm just going to continue on Najat's side. I think there is a lot of anxiety when people confuse transparency with explainability.
Yeah.
And then they try to basically say, I'm not able to explain this model, so how I can trust it. Someone who's not a biologist, after you ask 2 or 3 levels of questions of why, you figure out biology is not explainable. We don't necessarily know exactly what's happening. So it almost seems ironic to me that we keep pushing for explainability of these models. We are not able to explain it, so we don't trust it. But it actually can be transparent, it can be repeatable, in which case it might just be fine.
And ultimately, I suppose, from what you have said, it comes down to the choices that we make. We talk a lot about diversity and inclusion. Would we be bold enough to think about the inclusion of AI as a partner in our thinking, as much as we think about the inclusivity of society and some of the decisions that we make? Would we be bold enough to incorporate that assistance within it? And perhaps just in closing, I wonder if we could think about a call to action. There are leaders in this room from their respective organizations, their respective countries, and indeed, these are the choices that they will make for the patients and public that they serve. If you had one call to action that you would want them to take away, what might that be? And I'll start off with
Okay.
Amir.
Get engaged. The genie's out of the bottle. It's not like nuclear proliferation. We're not going to be able to stop this. Different countries, and you can do it in your garage. It's not like you don't need a nuclear plant for it. So the genie's out of the bottle. Get engaged, get informed, because you have to.
Amazing. Najat.
And I'm just going to add to it.
Yeah.
I think it's being bold to make that change. The incentives, I'm just going to say it, for a lot of people are not to change because change is concerning, it's threatening. But you know, I always say it's better to self-disrupt than to be disrupted. And the more you can actually do that, you know, really push for the adoption of these things, doing it the right way across all levels of the organization, it would be better for patients all around.
Zak.
I want to take a page from what Najat said. If you are one of these leaders, I think you need to insist on transparency. What data were these models trained on? And I will trust them a lot more if I knew what patient data, what biological data they're trained on. There are a variety of reasons that's been given why that cannot be known. I don't buy it. And I do think that is what society and the leaders who represent society should be insisting on.
Armen.
I'm going to use a very, very short analogy, but if we go back 140, 150 years ago, I told this to my team a couple of days ago, I think there was an analogous situation where internal combustion engine was just invented, but people didn't know if cars were going to be popular or not, and some people were saying cars are more dangerous than the dynamite, don't buy cars, they require maintenance, horses more predictable, so on. I think we are in a similar situation, and I think we should strive to be the drivers of these new cars, not the passengers. I think some people are going to be also mechanics of the cars. Not all of us have to be the mechanics, but I hope that all of us can be drivers of the cars. The clutch might be finicky, it might still be manual, but who cares? If we don't do it, then someone else is going to do it for us.
Mm-hmm.
So my sincere, sincere thanks to all of you for joining this panel and sharing your insights and your thoughts. And my ask of friends and colleagues would be, please show your appreciation to the panel today.